All right. Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our study through the Gospel of Matthew, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. We are going to get into chapter 8. Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount. Again, just a little kind of theological background. The way Matthew is telling the story is he combined really like several sermons. Now, there was the Sermon on the Mount, yes, but there were actually several kind of different times that he includes different parts of the sermon. Um, but there still was the Sermon on the Mount. Okay. Um, and again, remember this is his um, that was his criteria for being his disciples. The quality, what was important, that he elevated the quality. It wasn't. It wasn't just religious acts. Okay. Um, there are many religious people. The easiest thing to be is a religious person, because once they tell you, do follow commandments A, B, C, and then you do those things, and usually the commandments of men are lacking, and because that's all you have to do. Think about it, and to be accepted in uh, is most churches. Think about this: to be accepted in most churches, you just have to be a part of their group, their clique, meet their criteria, not God. Think about this: if you got enough money and clout, you can go to any theological school, right? You can go to any theological school, and then once you get a degree, right, in theology, you then can go and pastor any church. Now think about that. And while there's some that will say, "Oh no, we try to discern that people have, a relationship with Jesus and a relationship with Christ," oh, you can get around that. You just know how to play the game. You know what words to say, right? I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. Um, Jim Jones, the famed cult leader who led nearly 1,000 of his members to in South America, in I believe it's 1978, and I think he still leads today the largest mass suicide in our kind of recorded history. Think about that. But he had a theological degree. He was at the time billed as a Pentecostal preacher, I believe it was, and he played the game, but yet he was known to be an atheist. Okay, known to be an atheist. So, same thing with churches. So, think about this: if you could be a member of a church, especially if you're a tithe paying, you pay tithe, and your tithes are of substantial amount. They're going to waive pretty much anything else, right? You think about how people today have waived the flaws of the current president, because to them, he's going to meet their political agenda, right? So being religious is the easiest thing, because even, if you're in the clique, they're going to even excuse your flaws. Of course, if you're not in the clique, um, you're they're going to excuse me, um, kick you out. All right. Anyway, all right. Chapter 8. So chapter 8, and again, the study of the life of Jesus is fascinating. But listen, so he says, this is chapter 8, verse 1. And when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Now remember, the crowds followed him up to the crowd. They listened to him. They heard him preach. So now, verse 2, right away, a man with a serious skin disease came up and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, a couple of things about this. I'm using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. I like this particular Bible. It's a very easy read, and it is also a more accurate read. Now, that said, probably most other translations will translate this as leprosy. And I think pretty much in this Bible, they use skin disease as opposed to leprosy. Okay. And when I became a Christian, of course, learning the Bible, reading the Bible, I read the King James Bible. And it's even now, the King James really is still in me. Um, you may or may not pick up on that sometimes when I'm reading, that I will automatically kind of insert a King James translation in there because I'm so used to that. But that I find this translation is one of the most accurate translations, and I've asked one of the scholars of this translation why they use skin disease as opposed to leprosy, and they gave their justification for it. So that's the first other thing. Now, another thing is the problem with this. Well, not the problem, but this is going to be one of these things where the Pharisees would criticize Jesus for, because the law, leprosy or skin disease, as they translate, but the and the reason why I think the reason why a lot of translators translated leprosy too is because of the procedures. If you go back to the law of Moses and the procedures and the description of it. By the way, remember they it's not necessarily that the term leprosy was around back then. I let me put this more in the form of a question. But anyway, like I say, those kinds of discussions I'll leave in the hands of the scholars. But skin disease, leprosy, it really means the same. And but leprosy was not curable during that time. It is curable now, but it was a drastic, despicable disease, and it rotted your flesh to the point that sometimes you wouldn't even know it, and that sometimes people their limbs would be rotted away. They wouldn't even know that. It was also a highly contagious disease. The law basically said if you discovered that you had leprosy, you had to be separated from the Israelites, the camp. Okay, your sheets and things had to be burned, clothes had to be burned, tablecloths, the dishes had to be thoroughly washed. Okay. Now the reason why I'm gonna kind of throw this in is how people today responding to how they are responding to COVID-19. And it's kind of interesting that even the Bible had a prescription for contagious disease. Okay, and watch this. And the object was to prevent the spreading, which is interesting. It prevented you from catching it. In other words, the reason why God put that in there so that you wouldn't catch leprosy at the time, you wouldn't have to, So that's why they put that in there. In other words, when if they discover someone who had leprosy, they would again, yet they had to be separated. They were outcast, and you could not live, again, a normal life. Today there is a cure for leprosy, but back then they did. Now, so this guy coming when he approaches Jesus, this was risky. Especially if can you imagine if Jesus turned out to be a fake healer? Then this guy could have been stoned, by the way. Okay, but notice question, he says, Lord, if you are willing. Now think about that. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Verse 3, reaching out his hand, he touched him, saying, I am willing, be made clean. And immediately his disease was healed. Think about that statement right there. He says, Lord, if you are willing. And Jesus says, I am willing. And let me just say this. I have yet to find anywhere in Scripture where Jesus is not willing to heal, where he's not willing. Okay, so think about that. Now, without opening the can of worms, here's what I cannot answer: why people aren't being healed. In some cases, yeah, I can tell you fake healers, like your Benny Hinn's are fake healers. But I cannot answer why people, when they, when we say, when people, people will say, I know so and so who prayed for healing and they didn't get healed. I can't speak to that. Cannot speak to that at all. What I can tell you is, speaking for me, I take this from a very personal, Lord, I'm asking you, and I can't go beyond that. Okay. But he says, I am willing. And so he says his disease was healed. Now, verse 4, then Jesus told him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses prescribed as a testimony to them. Now we're going to see this statement, and it's always kind of wondering why Jesus said this, right? Why, when he tell people, don't go tell anyone, right? In other words, well, what really did he mean? See that you don't tell anyone. And there's a couple of thoughts on this. One, and you'll see this in other passages in the gospel, it's not that Jesus was saying keep quiet. I mean, obviously, if you a man that had leprosy and you no longer had leprosy, it's going to raise questions, right? People are going to ask, what happened to you? So a couple of thoughts in terms of why did Jesus wouldn't. First of all, he didn't want it being twisted in terms of how you broadcast it. Because the Pharisees would probably try to use it. And then secondly, the crowds would overrun him, and his purposes for being where he was oftentimes could be thwarted if if the people came, and sometimes he might not have been there for that reason. And then just a couple of observations. But then you will note that he says, but offer the gift that Moses prescribed as a testimony to them. So during this period of time under Jesus, and here's kind of an interesting kind of discussion or perspective, that during Jesus' 3.5 years public ministry, his 33 years of life, this was technically the Old Testament. He ministered under the Old Testament. So even though in our Bibles, the New Testament begins with the Gospels, technically, the New Testament probably shouldn't begin into the book of Acts. That's just a trivial kind of point. But notice he always told them to offer the gift. There were commandments that if a person was cleansed, and by the way, you go to the book of Leviticus, and especially Leviticus, there's a few chapters on what to do with leprosy, how to deal with leprosy. He was quite extensive. Moses was quite extensive in his instructions, when he gave to what to do with it. So, and there were, again, commandments that they had to offer. There were certain sacrifices that they had to offer when they were healed. Okay. And notice he's saying now, go to the priest and offer this. So going back to, if you went to the priest and the priest said to you, well, you're healed. How did you get healed? I'll tell you why. Because one of the things under the Old Testament law, the priest had to inspect that if you had leprosy, the priest would inspect you. And then once you were cleansed, the priest had to inspect you again. So obviously he's going to say, how did you get healed, right? You can say, "Oh, can't tell you." Oh, mum's the word. No. So anyway, um, uh, he said, "Go and offer the gift Moses prescribed for the testimony to them." He says, and when he entered Capernaum, now by the way, Capernaum became his kind of hometown. He left Nazareth. Let me show you a map here. Where are my handy maps is? If you notice here, look, Capernaum. Oh, wrong map here. Capernaum. Remember, Jesus grew up in Galilee, right? Look at Nazareth. That's number 10. He grew up in Nazareth, and um, oh, I know you can, but will you? I don't know what you mean, Pastor Ty. um, but I don't know what you mean. I know you can, but will you? All right. But he grew up in Nazareth, but notice where Capernaum is. It's number 7. That kind of a sea lake city, but that's where he's at this point. He comes to Capernaum, um, and well, let me go back here. It says right here, when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him. Now, this centurion was a Roman soldier. Okay, he says, "Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, in terrible agony. I will come and heal him." He told him. "Lord," the centurion replied, "I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be cured. For I, too, am a man under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. To my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." Hearing this, um, he says, hearing this, Jesus was amazed and said to those following him, "I assure you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great faith." Now, again, if you know, remember I said, notice Jesus was amazed by this man. Now, this centurion, and we will see this story told from different kind of perspectives. Um, what we know from the other gospels is that the centurion didn't even, when he said he didn't feel worthy to come to Jesus, he actually sent his servants. And there's no contradictory here, since a servant speaks for the one who sent. The messenger doesn't represent himself. This centurion, again, Jesus' fame is spreading around, his teaching, but also, of course, his miracles. And he sends his servant and he says to him, in fact, in the other gospel, we're going to see that there would be people that would even vouch for this centurion, that he was a God-fearing centurion, and that he built a synagogue. Well, he said, "You don't even have to come." I didn't even think myself worthy to come. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And that Jesus was amazed by that. He was amazed by this kind of faith. He said, wow. He said, and then the centurion even explains why. He says, "See, I know what authority is. When I say to my servants, they obey. They obey my word." What is more interesting about the centurion, was that he's doing this for his slave, his servant, his slave. Not even doing it for himself. He's doing it for his slave. Um, so, um, verse 10 again. Hearing this, Jesus was amazed and said to those following him, "I assure you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great faith." Now, there are 2 times in which Jesus will commend someone as having great faith, or an extraordinary, he would commend their faith. And in both cases, there are people who are not Israelites; they're Gentiles. This man was a Roman. I think coming up we'll see where a lady is a lady from Canaan, a Canaanite. Um, the Jews throughout their history have always, their unbelief has been unbelievable. And remember, God set up camp with them. God started the nation of Israel. Okay. Um, God has been with Israel, right? Uh, he set them up as a nation. He led them prophetically. He led them supernaturally, and they still rejected him. And even now, think about this. Jesus has been sent to Israel. He's not even going to the Gentiles, by the way. This centurion has come to Jesus. But Jesus' effort during this time, he is not going to the Gentiles. That would not come till later. And so when Jesus says, I haven't found this kind of faith in Israel, he's there, right? In other words, this, what does it take for them? And the centurion, in a sense, kind of lets us know. He just took Jesus at his word. He believed. You know what is amazing when you go back to the time of Moses? That first generation that Moses led out of Egypt, they died in the wilderness because they didn't believe. They refused to believe. Despite, remember, that God crippled the nation of Egypt, that he led them out of, he broke the bondage of slavery before the Egyptians' eyes. He led them out. He led them through the Red Sea, right? They saw this, parted the Red Sea. He led them through on dry ground. When the Egyptians tried, God closed the sea up and they drowned. God led them, he supernaturally provided for them manna, quail, water, but they refused to believe. In their second year, God says, it's time for you guys to go into the promised land. And God says, I want you to send 2 spies. And they thought, well, actually, God had told them, go into the promised land. Just go to the river, cross it, boom, go in there. They said, well, as they're talking to Moses, Moses is telling them, hey, God is saying, it's time for us to go into the promised land. They said, we should send some spies out. Let's see what the land is like. Moses was like, okay. They go and they come back and they said, oh, we can't take this land. There are giants in the land. They look at us like we're grasshoppers. We cannot, we're going to fail. Then they started complaining. Moses, why did you bring us out to kill us? Yada, yada, yada. And God said, you know what? You guys you're not going to go into the promised land. Your children that you claim was going to die in this wilderness, they're going to go into the promised land. But you guys are not going to go into the promised land because of your unbelief. And that's why they wandered for 40 years in that wilderness, that first generation, to God waiting to everyone who was 20 years old and upwards died. So at the time of Joshua, the oldest person, other than Joshua and Caleb, the oldest person was 60 years old. What was interesting about this is that when they then said, okay, now we're going to send, instead of sending 12, we're going to send 2 spies out. We're going to spy out the land. And what those spies found out is that everyone else around had more faith than Israel. Now, when I say faith, they believe that Israel's God was more powerful than any other God. And they were terrified of when Israel approached the Jordan. The prophet Balaam, false prophet Balaam, the reason why he makes the story is Barak, the Moab king, tried to hire him to curse him. Where the other nations failed at, they're acknowledging, saying that Israel's God is God of gods, but they did not submit to God, and that's why they were destroyed. But they acknowledge that God, he's going to destroy us. That's the God that delivered Israel to from Egypt. They believe in that respect more. Where they lacked is that they did not submit to God. So when Jesus says here, he was amazed that here is this Gentile who Jesus wasn't laboring among, had this kind of faith. Okay, he had this kind of faith. So he says, verse 10 again, hearing this, Jesus was amazed and said to those following, I assure you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great of faith. I tell you that many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then Jesus told the centurion, go, as you have believed, let it be done for you. And the servant was cured that very moment. That very moment. Now, one thing that I'm gonna go back and I want you to see this. This is Jesus said that the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into outer darkness, and in that place will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, again, the only reason why people go to hell is because they don't believe. Understand that. There's no other reason. The reason is they don't believe. And so he's, again, even proclaiming to them, no other generation, by the way, just this generation that witnessed, again, the manifestation of the Son of God was greater than even the generation that lived under Moses. Because think about all of the miracles that Jesus was doing, the teaching, and yet they will notice he said, I can't find this kind of faith in Israel. All right. Verse 14 says, when Jesus went into Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now, if you are Catholic, by the way, if you're Catholic, this verse should trouble you because of the teaching. The Catholic Church teaches that the apostles wasn't married, and of course you see that they teach the priests and nuns cannot be married, that they have to take vows of celibacy. And such doctrines, of course, are doctrines of men. Notice we see here that Peter was married, and we get a little insight. It's one just a little kind of snapshot into Peter's life in that, notice his mother-in-law was sick, and so he healed her. Verse 15, so he touched her hand, talking about Jesus, and the fever left her. She got up and began to serve him. And when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. He drove out the spirits with the word and healed all who were sick. Now, I'm going to get more into demon possession probably in the next chapter when we're going to see this story about demon possession. But notice the incredible amount of works, healings, people who are truly demon possessed. Jesus is setting them free. And this, in the next verse, he says, verse 17, so that what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, he himself took our weakness and carried our disease. Now, this promise or this fulfillment of this scripture in Jesus healing people. But notice the prophecy. Let me go back to it. Notice the prophecy. Um, so that it was spoken that he himself took our weaknesses and carried our diseases. This is a fulfillment of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah, that Jesus would, again, carry our sicknesses. Again, I think this is a valid promise for today, okay? That Jesus um, carried our, he took our sicknesses, carried our diseases, and it says by his stripes we were healed. I'm sorry. Um, but I think this is, again, a valid promise. The ultimate fulfillment, of course, is showing the manifestation of the Messiah as he is now ministering to the nation of Israel. Verse 18, and when Jesus saw large crowds around him, he gave the order to go to the other side of the sea. A scribe approached him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus told him, Foxes have dens and the birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Lord, another of his disciples said, First, let me go bury my father. But Jesus told him, Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Now, some of this may seem very, very harsh, okay? Especially some of the theology that we see today. Some of the theology we see today, doesn't fit this, okay? In other words, it's more man-centered theology than it is Christ-centered. And this puts it right where it certainly is anything but man-centered gospel or man-centered theology. And that's kind of a best description of a lot of what's going on is how you feel, what you think, your feelings, your needs, right? Everything comes from your perspective. You have to be ministered to. Well, Jesus here, think about this, that Jesus is very, very clear when it comes to devotion to him. Okay? He's very, um, um, again, and by the way, this scribe that tells him, I will follow you, and he says, then the foxes don't have dens and the birds of the sky do not have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. So Jesus did not own real estate. He did not have a financial portfolio when he was here. Jesus, of course, his purpose was very singular and focused. The apostles did have lives. We see this, for example, in the 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul talks about that. He says, does you look at the other apostles, he pretty much said they have wives, they have money, they have homes. He says, and that's their right to have that. What Jesus is dealing with here is, of course, again, pretense. There was a scribe that came up to him. And by the way, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were the people, it was good to be a Pharisee. It was good to, because it was good to be a scribe. A scribe basically was the person who wrote down the law. He also was a teacher. But basically, because he was a scribe, he was, they wrote the law. You can also say transcribe the law. But they were also teachers of the law as well. But they were, again, just as hypocritical sometimes as the Pharisees. So to follow Jesus, and Jesus makes his point crystal clear. If you're going to be my disciples, you have to give up all. So it's not the kind of a deal where you look at it and say, well, this is what I'm going to get if I follow Christ. And again, I know what it's like to be under a man-centered theology, where your service, and if you're under a man-centered theology, then you see the gospel through the lens of what you're going to get. You also are disappointed when you don't get what is promised to you, and that's something you have to look at. See, from God's standpoint, think about this now. We um, we think you know, it's kind of interesting. I'll tell you this. My son-in-law just went through uh, surgery from cancer, and his surgery went well. But so when you're thinking about cancer, a life-threatening, he had thyroid cancer. Um, One of the interesting things that the emotions that people go through, they say, well, he can't live it. Look about, the young children. He has to be around. And part of the prayer is saying, he had the kids need their father. Now, God will say, no, they don't. To try to come to God with that kind of bargaining, God will say, no, they don't. Because think about it, people die all the time. I know myself. My first wife passed away when my kids were small, and that was one of my prayers. Like the kids need their mother, and God's like, no, they don't. Now that may seem harsh, but think about it from this perspective. She's in heaven. If we all die, we go to heaven. And what one of the most shocking and sobering truths, and this is what Jesus is saying right here. Think about this. Jesus, when the man says here, look at verse 21. Lord, another one said, let me first go bury my father. What he is kind of saying is, in the sense, it may or may not even have been a death process. In other words, his father, in a sense, may not necessarily have been dying. So he wasn't asking to go on leave. But the idea is that, again, follow me and let the dead bury their dead, right? Again, Jesus is being very shocking, sobering. Why? Because God doesn't see life the way we see life. Remember, God lived outside of our spectrum of life. And yeah, it can be seen cold-blooded what he's saying right here. But he doesn't see life the way we see life. And that's shocking. However, but also think about this. If you think this is kind of shocking with Jesus, from a historic perspective, the next 3 centuries would be some of the hardest that Christians as a whole face. Right? We know them as the persecution that began to ramp up shortly after Jesus ascended into heaven. By the time we get to AD 65, 66, with the Emperor Nero, Christian persecution was in full swing. So to be a Christian during those early centuries really was a death sentence, or you got tortured, jailed, you would lose your livelihood, your wealth. It was open season on Christians. And to that, God says there was, when people say, but God, you have to understand. No, God, this is what he's telling you. And the shock of this is what you will face. Now, of course, they faced it oftentimes with much zeal, okay, to the point that Christianity grew during these outbursts of persecution. The roughest of which I think came in the early 3rd century, right before the Emperor Constantine became a Christian. And when Constantine became a Christian, overnight persecution stopped for the Christians. People that were in jail being tortured, those being executed, that's immediately stopped. And in some respects, that was probably one of the worst things that happened for Christians. Yea, if you were the ones in jail or in torture or getting ready to be executed. But from that point, you see a kind of a weakening in the faith in the church. From that, you can chart a lot of things from that point of view. And so the idea is that when Jesus says here, this is the price. Now, in every generation since Christ, every generation, there's been persecution. So even now, there is persecution in certain parts of the world. We in America, we don't know that kind of persecution. That's why I said our theologies oftentimes are contaminated with man-centered. What can God do for us? Well, and that's the way kind of sometimes the gospel is presented. What can I do for you? Instead of, no, it's not like that at all. If you live in a lot of parts of the Middle East, Iran, or China, or North Korea, Christians suffered. They still suffer like those of the first and second century and third century Christians. Which goes back to what Jesus is saying right here. If you want to be my disciple, this is the price. In other words, he's focusing people is that this is not just a fad. In other words, all right, guys, we'll pick it up with we'll finish out. We'll pick it up. Where did I leave off? Verse. Well, let's see. We'll pick it up again with verse 21. Jesus is going to reiterate this throughout the Gospels too. By the way, He's never going to apologize for this. He's never going to. Yeah, gee, I understand why. No, He's never going to do that. Jesus demands 100% commitment, 100% loyalty and devotion to Him. You're never going to see anywhere where He compromised that. All right, guys. Till next time, I'll see you then.